Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Left Book Club event. Tonight, we'll be discussing our book of the month for April, Climate Strike by Derek Wall. We're really excited to have some inspiring guests under one virtual roof tonight or tomorrow, wherever you're watching us. My name is Elif, and I work on the Left Book Club's political education program. Before we get into the event, just a little bit about the Left Book Club and what we do and who we are. The Left Book Club is a subscription book club and a not-for-profit initiative. We publish collectible editions of radical books, which are uniquely available to our members and are posted out each month. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that crucially inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Our Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal speakers over the months, so feel free to check out our video library on YouTube after you watch tonight for discussions engaging with a wide range of radical thought. Tonight, while you're watching, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat, and we'll make sure our guests will get to answering them. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click join. Don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with incredible events like this, promotions and giveaways, and some really exciting stuff we have in the pipeline, which we can't wait to share with you. And while you're watching us tonight, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if the stream does go choppy, this has never really happened, please stay with us and we'll make sure we're running smoothly as soon as possible. So tonight we're joined by Derek Wall, the author of the book we'll be discussing and the themes of it, Amelia Womack and Jody Dean, to discuss how climate change is a product of the entire social and economic system within which we exist in a world, capitalism. They will explore what we can do now, and I suppose to at least slow the rising emissions. A bit about the actual book. The climate crisis here, burning forests, melting glaciers, and increasingly extreme weather patterns, which actually is so much more recognizable even in the last month, even being in the UK, I suppose. Weather patterns point to an unfolding catastrophe. In his book, Derek Wall looks at every aspect of the crisis. What can we do? How can we be effective and practical? How can we build an ecological economy? This is a major contribution to the practical politics of creating a sustainable and just future, drawing on decades of research and activism. So Derek Wall is the former international coordinator of the Green Party of England and Wales. He teaches political economy at Goldsmiths College and is the author of 12 books. Amelia Womack has been the deputy leader of the Green Party for 3 years. She has worked across the country visiting hundreds of local campaigns, events, and organizations. She works to raise awareness of local issues while campaigning for change on a national level. She was elected in 2014 at the age of 29, while still a member of the Young Greens, and has used this platform to highlight problems affecting young people, from tuition fees to zero-hour contracts. She holds a bachelor's in environmental biology and master's in environmental technology. She works across a wide range of social and environmental issues with a particular focus on women's rights, flooding, climate change, and community resilience. Jody Dean, who is joining us all the way from across the pond, is a political theorist and organizer in upstate New York. Her books include The Communist Horizon, Crowds and Party, and Comrade, an essay on political belonging, all published by Verso. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Derek, who will talk a bit about his book and set the scene for the discussion tonight. Derek, over to you.
Okay, so 3 things. The main thing, thanks, what the book's about. So the main thing I want to get you to get from the book is find out about the Underground Network. If you're in Wales, join. If you're somewhere else, do something similar. And this kind of, community Marxism, community social building the base is really what I want to kind of get over with the book. Thanks. Well, thank you to Merlin Fishing originally. And, because I love to get really cheap books out, and I would appall publishers by saying just get it for the library. So Merlin were great at getting like a, under a tenner book out. And thanks also, of course, to Left Book Club for republishing it. And wanted to thank very much Jodie and Amelia. So Jodie, I think is almost uniquely somebody who is a theorist and an academic who combines that with practical action. And I think sometimes there's danger that we have an activism, we're not using concepts and we're strategic, and quite often as academics we're not active. And she was very supportive of the book, so saw something on a Facebook post which I thought was really clear, and she was kind enough to let me republish the book. So I'll read you what you said, which I think is quite key. And I think we have to be aware that climate change is here now. Super rich are grabbing more and more product. They're buying up more land, hoarding. Housing is built so the rich have more and the poor have nothing. And the thing is, the rich, the right, have people, forces throughout the government and in the streets. They fight tenaciously and refuse compromise. So, the forces of evil, the forces on the right, they're organised for climate change. They're going to protect themselves and they're going to punish us. So I appreciate Jodie just generously letting me put that on there. Worked a lot with Amelia. Amelia is absolutely tremendous and has got this huge energy going around the country, talking to people about green politics, and has been somebody who's really worked tenaciously to move the Green Party of England and Wales left. To really applaud that, and anything I can do to support her ongoing work is important. And I think particularly she's been tremendous recently in working as an ally to trans and non-binary comrades. So it's tremendous to have both of you coming along. I'll talk a little bit about the book. I guess all of you, you have books. I kind of bought this, Three-Body Problem, really great. I bought this, Legacy of Violence, really great. Then Buddhism. So I've got all these books, and they pile up, and they take time to read. So I was going to talk a little bit about what I was trying to do with the book, and then other people can take it in whatever direction is necessary. So my kind of starting point with the book is to think, how can we think as strategically as possible about the climate crisis and then act precisely? And I think there's a danger that maybe we're not thinking through things, we're not being strategic, we're not being precise. And what's so important is to think, how do we actually intervene and struggle and change things? I think there's a danger that when we look at political ideas, we look for a kind of mirror, that we've got existing ideas, and when we see other people reflecting the same ideas, we're happy. So we say veganism is important, people are eating vegan, we have that nice feeling in our stomach. I'm certainly not knocking veganism, but there's a danger that politics revolves around ideologies, where we're in groups and we have identities politically, for people with the same ideas. And what I think is kind of important is to think, how do we actually change things? How do we intervene? So I think, sometimes, all the time, inevitably, we're going to have massive disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements are so great that we can't work with people. But a lot of the time, disagreement is the salt in the soup that makes it taste better. Disagreement generates ideas, and the point isn't to belong to a group, but is to actually intervene practically, change things, So, you're going to disagree with me. So, most people would say William Morris is Britain's president. I would say, in fact, no, it's Cornelius Cardew. And then if you know Cornelius Cardew, you would say, oh, I like progressive rock. That was very good. And I would say, I prefer revolution is the main trend. What I'm to be serious is that there are disagreements. And like the profound thing is to think about what works, how to be strategic, how to intervene, how to kind of change things. And so often politics degenerates into there's a particular organization and your comrades are in the organization, and then there's groups you're opposed to who are often the kind of closest group. And it's very difficult to kind of import strategy back into politics. So to give you some brief ideas of the book, my starting point is that capitalism is the cause of climate change, that capitalism is based on economic growth, commodification, simplification, destruction of ecosystems, and we need to transcend capitalism. So another thing I really like from Jodie is on her Twitter, communism is our horizon comrades, and we have to kind of view capitalism as the enemy of human beings and the rest of nature. We need an economic system that transcends that. We need to hold things in common. We need to talk about kind of communism. So quite a bit in the book is talking about commons, property. Like my academic work, to the extent I do any academic work, is looking at Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win a prize in economics. And what she looked at is how you make the commons work, that it is possible to produce collectively, have a more collective, diverse economy, and have one which is based not on short-term profit, but long-term sustainability. I'm being told the internet isn't great. I hope you can hear me, but internet access isn't always great. I think part of the kind of work from Ostrom is how you make commons work, how you have an alternative economic system. Oh, she's not somebody who's come from left. And what I do in the book is look at Green parties, Extinction Rebellion, social movements, trade unions. But what I'm essentially saying is, how can we build the capacity to change? So, there's been a lot of interest in Marx and Marxism. I think it's important to look also at Lenin. What I take from Lenin is not necessarily his ideology, and Lenin is nearly always taken out of context, that what was happening in pre-revolutionary Tsarist Russia is very, very different now. But what Lenin was really focused on is how you intervene in a particular context, political change. So what I'm concerned with is how you build an anti-capitalist left to overcome the ecological crisis by overcoming capitalism. And to me, part of it is about building capacity. So what I'm kind of interested in the book is advocating the idea of dual power, building alternative institutions, and building capacity for political change in all ways. Quite often politics is purely electoral, or you have kind of protest movements like Extinction Rebellion, which are about polarizing people, getting attention to climate. How do you actually build long-term political capacity? So what I'm interested in is this kind of base building concept, which has been bigger in the States, socialists, and the main people doing it where we are is underground networks. So what they do is take stuff from the Panthers, have breakfast clubs, feed people. So that might seem distant from climate change, but the logic is we need to overcome capitalism. And of course, we need reform now and action on climate change. And I do like modest performance parish council work and getting solar panels on our church halls and doing that. We need to transcend capitalism. Certainly in Britain, there's been hundreds of thousands of people in radical politics with the Green Wave and then Corbyn. And that to some extent has been dissipated. So what I'm interested in is either of, community, revolutionary action, feeding people and defending communities already in an era of crisis. And actually by doing practical work, meeting your neighbours, you build some capacity for change. So there's a lot of different things I cover in the book. But one of the things that really inspired me was the kind of idea of John Kavaius, who is the resistance fighter, who talked about, how we have to, who resisted the Nazis, but was also a philosopher of philosophy of mathematics, so had like strong philosophical concepts. And where I really finished, I think possibly biased to the French, but I will stop soon, was with Guattari at the end saying technology advances, but social institutions don't. I will their apologies if I've been choppy.
Thank you so much for that, Derek. Amelia, let's go over to you.
Thank you so much. And such a good reflection on grassroots movements and how change happens. And every time I hear about any political change, it makes me realize that often change only happens when you're going person to person, person to person, person to person, and spread that spark of inspiration within our communities. I've been deputy leader actually for 8 years, and it's been an interesting time because there's been a lot of change in politics since then. 8 years ago, the BBC was still talking about climate change like it was a debate, like we were talking about if it was real or if it wasn't, rather than platforming the ideas about how we tackle the biggest issue of our time. We've seen the rise of Extinction Rebellion raising the alarm of how little time we have left, that pushed for climate emergency policy, climate emergency bills going through Parliament, going through local councils, to really put at the forefront the need for radical change to tackle the biggest issues of our time. But then we saw COVID hit. We had a lot of people, I believe, thinking quite about the big picture. Never before had I seen issues like a universal basic income be so, people feeling so inspired, so engaged by it, and people talking about things like that in a really different way. People talked about building back better. And then suddenly the Conservative government instead built back to exactly the same as things had been before. I think that people were really challenging the systems that brought us to a point where a global pandemic was, the impacts that we were looking at our economy, the way that we were thinking about our environment. Lots of people were thinking very differently. And I think that people were seeing the problems when it came to issues around climate, questioning how we got here, wondering what could have been done sooner as well, was something that came up quite a few times. I think the reality is that simply first of all, climate justice and social justice and economic justice are completely intertwined. I often talk to people as if I'm using the environment as some kind of backdoor anti-capitalist movement, but it's really exposing, environmentalism really exposes the problem with our economy that not only works for an elite few, but also damages our planet, which our entire lives are based on. Let's not forget that we need this planet for food and water, the resources that that we base our jobs on, that then create business, that therefore creates the economy. All of these things are interlinked, and unless we're looking at this as a complete picture, we are missing the point. But what we've seen is a government that has failed to really take action on this. And I really question if the government had an issue with Extinction Rebellion and the protest movements that have evolved from there, they could stop them by actually putting policies in place that tackle these big issues, whether that's stopping oil or putting in home insulation now. The best way to really ensure that we are changing something would be to put those policies in place. Instead, we see our government putting in draconian laws that give police more power to stop protesters, and ignoring our democratic rights to speak up, because people are angry. People are angry that has got to this point, because right now, while we're sat here, we have record temperatures in India and Pakistan with a kind of humidity that means that people, when they sweat, are actually not cooling down, creating increased health risk within their populations, and no real signs of that heat going away. The climate emergency is here. We have to end talking about it, as I've seen many politicians still do, as if it's some kind of future event. It's here right now. It's here in the people at COP that I was speaking to from Bangladesh, who were asking for some kind of shelter for their livestock, because what's being put in place is climate resilience in their country has been there to protect people, but not the livelihoods that they have. And many farmers, after severe floods in their communities, have lost everything and just don't want to live because they're not able to put food on their table, and they've no longer got a roof over their heads. It was in the lives of the people from the Philippines where typhoons killed so many people that when they were trying, they didn't know if anyone was going to come and help them on their islands, and they had to try and get food from the ocean where they were, which was exactly the same place as the bodies were. And it's here in the UK, it's here in the flooding that we see in our communities, it's here in the wildfires that we're seeing across so many continents at the moment. It's here and now, and yet the government is not taking action. I think that, simply put, the greenest option should be the cheapest and easiest option. I often question why I've got, when I'm thirsty, you end up with a plastic bottle in your hand when it's not the best thing for the environment. It's because a government decision has been made that enables us to use these resources rather than ensuring that the alternative is what's made cheap and easy. And that's from everything from public transport to home insulation. Everything is a broken system that is harming people. This cost of living crisis is something that should really expose that. And I'm incredibly angry at the austerity agenda that cut so much from our communities. It was threadbare before this cost of living crisis hit. And we've gone from people talking about missing a meal, and so eating 2 meals a day, to people not being able to eat every day. This has been as a result of over a decade of failure from this government, and failure that continues, when the reality has been and still is that a Green New Deal is a real way that we can tackle these issues of social injustice and issues around climate justice as well, hand in hand, about ensuring that we are investing in communities. And yes, it will cost money. I know this government's looking at non-fiscal ways to tackle the cost of living crisis, which is basically not putting money into tackling what's harming people's lives. Let's not forget, this isn't just about winter fuel bills. This is about, during austerity, there were people who lost their lives because they were diabetic and they had to choose between eating and switching their fridge on, and their fridge had their insulin in. And those people aren't with us now. A Green New Deal could genuinely work to tackle this broken economic system that is rigged to a few people benefiting, and ensure that we are putting that investment in communities. Yes, it costs money, but the reality is it's like building a hospital. It has upfront costs, but then what you have is something that means that we have something for the well-being of our generation and generations to come that tackle problems in our communities. Don't forget your own power. This isn't just about politicians. Remember your own power at every step, about raising the alarm and ensuring that we use every form of democracy we can to hold this government to account. This is just a first step that this government has taken to, attacking our rights to protest and our democracy. And we must continue to speak out and ensure that we pass on that flame of inspiration. As I said, political change happens person to person, person to person, person to person. So think about what action you want to take to ensure that we are speaking out and making change happen.
Thank you so much for that, Amelia. And Jodie, over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm very happy to be part of the discussion. It continues one that Kai Heron and I had with Derek and Andreas Malm on climate Leninism. I think that was last summer. My comments are deeply informed by my conversations and writing with Kai. So anyway, on to Derek's book, Climate Strike, because my remarks will focus on his book. I share Derek's core premises that he mentioned at the beginning. Climate change is a product of capitalism. The struggle around climate change is a political struggle, and the political struggle is really, really hard, and we have no time. Derek does a great service by setting out the various challenges facing political struggle around climate change and by detailing various tactical and strategic considerations. In the interest of comradely exchange and in keeping with Derek's call to join the battle of ideas and think, I'm going to draw out some of the places where we disagree. My hope is that sharpening these disagreements contributes to strategic thinking on the left. And these disagreements, we don't even have to call them disagreements. We can call them questions for all of us. And there's four: the base building strategy, the state, dual power, and revolution. So base building, that's the primary approach that Derek advocates. And of course, he's very careful to emphasize that, a whole slew of strategies and tactics will be necessary, that dogmatism is to be avoided, and that flexibility and experimentation are crucial. Base building is for Derek a practical approach that seems promising, right? So he wants us to consider this practical approach. He's not dogmatically saying, oh, this is the only thing anybody who cares about climate change and capitalist inequality can do. He's not saying that. He's just saying, like, this is promising. Okay, so what is it and why is it promising? Base building involves community-oriented practical action, like creating local trade unions, tenant organizations, legal support for prisoners, community gardens, advice centers. The idea is that neoliberalism has eviscerated the institutions of the working class, so these have to be rebuilt. Rebuilding will let socialists connect directly with the people, and it will help create what Derek calls communities of resistance. As Derek says, what is being built is a community of activists. Now, that's an honest admission. For the most part, community gardens and local advice centers are ways to build activist communities. They're part of activist culture, a culture that has been largely oriented to resistance rather than, say, reform or revolution, which are approaches that target the state. Whether building lefty activist culture strengthens the working class is an empirical question. Clearly, some mutual aid endeavors meet real social needs for food and other kinds of provisioning that arise because of the failure of the capitalist state to compensate for extreme inequality. In the US during COVID, forms of community food provision were crucial to the survival of many households. How then but here's the empirical part, right? Like, how do the mutual aid efforts of base builders compare with those of churches, mosques, and synagogues, with state-backed NGOs, with state-funded food programs? This is the kind of empirical precision and question that could help our analyses here. Is it and then further in this vein, is it the case that strengthening activist subcultures strengthens the working class? This also strikes me as an empirical question. In some instances, the vibe in these kinds of spaces is a turnoff, and the efforts remain very, very small. Rather than being engaged with the class where they are, like churches, sports clubs, pubs, the creation of new clubs and social centers can intensify divisions within the class, reinforcing a cultural divide instead of being unity. But of course, this too is an empirical and practical question. What may be a more theoretical and strategic question, though, is the link between base building and climate politics. And Derek mentioned this in his opening remarks. Insofar as Derek emphasizes communities of resistance and making these more coherent and resilient, the point seems to be a kind of survivalism. It's not at all clear to me how localism make sense as a response to global heating, where our priorities have to be ending reliance on fossil fuels, building alternative electrical grids, re-engineering the global economy, and so on. These are global tasks demanding state power and international cooperation. A community, a city can become entirely climate friendly and still all burn to death, be flooded out, or find themselves with a doubled or tripled population due to an influx of climate refugees, and so on. Derek rightly says that revolutionary eco-socialism, quote, needs to be built by millions of us. Base building, though, doesn't have the capacity for such a task, even as it might be really satisfying on a local level. So to be clear, I'm not opposed to base building. It seems to me to name an approach to mutual aid that has a political horizon beyond the immediate meeting of needs. Yet Derek presents the horizon as resistance, building communities of resistance, which means coping with and pushing back against things that are happening to us. Like the only power we can possibly generate is the power not to be eaten alive or burned to death or flooded or something like this. But what I want to emphasize is I think that that a community of resistance is much too narrow a horizon. The challenge of global climate struggle has at least two aspects, right? Scale and coordination. The dimension of scale is the easiest to see. We need forms of struggle that are more than assemblies of locals, that are more than experimental communities of resistance. We need organizational approaches that operate at national and international scales, that can adopt national and international perspectives and strategies. Obviously, if massive amounts of coal burning and deforestation supplement for cuts in oil production and supply, then we haven't made any advance. The dimension of scale, this immediately confronts us with a second issue, coordination. How do we make decisions about strategies, tactics, and priorities at a national and international scale? What assumptions guide or should guide our deliberations? This is where shared values and common principles matter enormously. It's also where the question of our politics comes in. What are we fighting for? What is the line that we hold in common? What principles are we committed to fighting? Right? We all know that as the climate catastrophe intensifies, so will the fascist and ethno-nationalist. Now is the time we have to establish an irrevocable anti-imperialist international commitment that prioritizes the regions and peoples most immediately and heavily impacted by climate change. And this, of course, includes welcoming climate refugees and providing all necessary and material and financial support for a just transition. In my view, this matter of our shared principles, or in other words, our political line, is where we need to put the communism in eco-socialism. Calling for democracy and participation in a world where the far right has enormous political power and where most liberals view communists as bad or worse than fascists strikes me as weak tea. Why not emphasize revolutionary party building? The strengthening of climate politics in already existing parties, the greater merging of the climate justice movement and revolutionary socialism. Why not prioritize international forms like the Progressive International and the International People's Alliance, strengthening the eco-socialist elements in them? We might also understand this as part of what it means to recognize the struggle around the climate as a political struggle. As a political struggle, it is best waged through revolutionary politics, and the form for that politics is the party. The second site of disagreement is the state. Derek says, don't trust the state is not our friend, beware of modernist state projects. Now, trust, friendliness, and modernism are like not the issue. The issue is what forms of power do we need to stop increases in carbon emissions, combat the ongoing heating of the planet, ensure that climate change does not devastate the lives of oppressed, colonized, and exploited people, and build a just, egalitarian alternative in which people and the planet can flourish. The issue isn't trust the state, it's take it over, smash it, reconfigure it, repurpose it. Frankly, given the sorts of infrastructures that are going to need to be built because of rising seas, it's time to stop trashing large-scale modernist projects and learn positive lessons from mid-20th century projects, like not to mention earlier ones. At the very least, state power is necessary as a counter to capitalist power and private forms of power, right? Like, it's so weird to me that, I don't know if it was the same with y'all, but in the US, there's been like a stupid amount of attention given to Jeff Bezos for doing what the Soviets did in 1961. Like, oh, great, he went to space. The communists did this a whole lot earlier. Relatedly, we have to jettison the tired critique of centralism. The problem on the left is fragmentation and dispersion. That's a sign of our incapacity. It's not a strength. The third side of disagreement follows from the first two, the question of dual power. Derek presents base building as drawing from Lenin's concept of dual power. But the view Derek presents has nothing in common with Lenin's account of dual power. I mean, maybe it's another view of dual power, that's fine. But Lenin says but Derek says it's Lenin, but it's not. Lenin introduces the concept of dual power in an article in Pravda in April 1917 in an analysis of the Russian Revolution. And at that point, because this is April in 1917, he means the February Revolution. The February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar did not result in the uncontested rule of the bourgeoisie or in a working class a working class government, but in an unexpected situation where there was the bourgeois provisional government and alongside it, the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies. The situation of dual power then is a situation where there are two parallel governments. One has the organs of power, that was the provisional government. The other rests on the support of the majority of the people, of armed workers and soldiers. For Lenin, the Soviets, especially the Petrograd Soviet, precisely because they were organizations of armed workers and soldiers, were steps toward the dictatorship of the proletariat. The power of the Soviets rested, quote, not on the law, but directly on the force of the armed masses of the population, end quote. Lenin emphasized three aspects of this unique dual power. First, whatever authority the provisional government had was the result of the Petrograd Soviet voluntarily having agreed to support it. In other words, the Petrograd Soviet voluntarily ceded authority to the provisional government. Second, this ceding created a situation of two interlocking dictatorships, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and a dictatorship of the proletariat. And third, Lenin says, this situation cannot last, or it could not last. It was temporary, a class standoff. Two powers cannot exist in one state, Lenin tells us. One of them is bound to pass away. Dual power isn't a tactic or a solution, it's a stalemate, one created by the armed power of workers and soldiers, not by small-scale mutual aid societies. It's not dual power when community groups try to fill the gaps left by privatization and austerity. Unions and tenant organizations are not dual power, although they're, of course, necessary forms of organizing against bosses and landlords. Finally, revolution. Derek turns to base building as dual power because he thinks revolutionary change, quote, does not look like an immediate option in most parts of the world, end quote. Derek correctly observes that with climate change, revolutionary situations are more likely and that we need to be prepared. For him, this preparation is base building, new seeds for new forms of government as well as new communities of resistance. To my mind, we need to be prepared for a struggle for power, a struggle that will unfold on an international scale. Who, like which class, which politics, will have the power to install and defend the new forms of governance that Derek mentions. Lenin tells us that a chief symptom of every real revolution is the unusually rapid, sudden, and abrupt increase in the number of ordinary citizens who begin to participate actively, independently, and effectively in political life and in the organization of the state, end quote. Lenin doesn't describe revolution as an option. Revolution is a rapid drawing of millions into the struggle for political power. Even more, the struggle over the form political power will take. It's not an option. It isn't chosen. It chooses. It forces millions into its sweep. The key to winning in this situation is organization and consciousness, the effective combination of theory and practice. How might the millions be pushed, led, steered in one direction rather than another? What will enable them to see a specific direction as the correct one? Not a view that emphasizes the fact that there are multiple and diverse options, which is an empirical fact, not a political proposition. What's necessary is a sense of that direction, right? And the sense of the direction to go has to be held by hundreds of thousands willing to follow it and enforce it. Derek thinks that blueprints can be oppressive. I think they can be inspiring. They give us direction and they show us how different pieces fit together in a workable vision, a vision of something in contrast simply to change, which is just like really abstract. Nevertheless, because we can't predict which set of events will kick off a revolutionary situation, we have to plan for the institutions we have, as well as for their demise. Derek's clear-eyed recognition of the real barriers that mainstream politics present to radical organizing is helpful on this front. I'll close by adding additional tactics to this, right? Adding to the base building, right? Rather than saying, oh God, no, right? I'm just adding to this. And these additional tactics, I think, take the state more seriously. These would include infiltration and the occupation of existing institutions. People may have heard that horrible stuff is going on in the US with abortion. The Catholic Church has been really successful in occupying institutions, right? So women in the US are about to lose our right to an abortion. 6 Catholics sit on the US Supreme Court, and approximately a third of the federal judiciary is Catholic. This suggests to me that we Marxist, eco-socialist, climate Leninists should not poo-poo the universities, the law, and the bureaucracy, but recognize that these are sites of power that we should fight over and win. And so I think mainstream politics, electoral politics remain absolutely crucial and deserve a great deal of sort of investment, intention, and respect. So I appreciate Derek's writing of this book and pushing left debate on these crucial questions.
Thank you very much for that, Jody. Derek, I really hope that your internet will hold up for a response, or to kind of come back on some of these. And then Amelia, maybe if there's anything you want to say. We do have a few questions from our viewers, but I'll leave that for the next round of things. Derek.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. I hope you can hear me. I've been told to be brief because it's unstable on the internet. We've got vast disagreement on things, but we're on the same terrain. And I'm just kind of quite flattered. Really, you read it so seriously and critiqued it, and we're moving on to a kind of strategic terrain. So in terms of agreements, disagreements, I have other questions about state. I think we do need to kind of reassess a lot of the experience of socialism and communism in the 20th century, and more went right than went wrong. And yes, you do have to do things on a state scale, entirely given the stage of the crisis, and I'm aware of your work and Kai's on that. But I'm just aware that most people we're debating with, have a very liberal idea that you demonstrate and you lobby and you make demands, and then the state does everything. And the class nature of the state and various other problems mean that we obviously cannot view the state as neutral. And maybe I'm pushing too much into decentralism. And I'm very much a kind of Ostrom scholar, and she wasn't a Marxist. But I think what I would take from her is kind of polycentricism, that some things have to be global, some things have to be done nationally, but they're only going to work if you get input from the grassroots. probably nobody can hear me on the internet, but base building quite often floats into mutual aid and is quite mild reformism. What I'm looking at is more people like fully socialists or Welsh Underground who are badged Marxist-Leninists. I know those of us who are Marxist-Leninists disagree about everything. And they build the tenants' unions, and you squat the community garden, and you do the local trade union work because it's good, it's useful, but also all the time that draws people in. So if we're talking about Marxist-Leninism, it needs to be a politic of billions. So often revolutionary groups are organizations of twos and threes. And I mean, I'm not essentially an empiricist, but if you look, for example, at Welsh Underground, it's built from like 2 people, Chapter is growing fast, is rooted in the working class. And if you do practical action, talk to your neighbours, that's very different from the activist ghetto. There's probably a lot more I could say. There's a lot in what you've said that I haven't got time to think about now. But I think useful to have these sharp debates. I mean, one thing where I think I am cautious is, yes, I think there's value in a kind of Leninist view of the party, but that's remaining on the whole a puzzle to be solved rather than actually having like finished, complete examples that we can pick up that seem to work. And I think there's a danger of having a kind of a non-Leninist politics where it's not about intentional interaction in the working class and building your power. I recognise in the situation you're saying, but often, and certainly not you, but so often on the left, people have a very fossilized idea of Lenin and can't then put it in context. But thank you for your very useful critique.
Thank you very much, Derek.
Probably nobody heard any of that.
I think people were really interested and really engaged with all that was being said. But thank you very much. Emilio, do you have anything to come back on?
Yeah, just a couple of points. And I think that one of the important areas is that connection to community and how we organize in community as a leading place. When I won't talk about this in terms of political terms, I'm a scientist, and so we'll talk about it in terms of scientific terms. But when we look at the current need to reduce carbon emissions, there's only a certain amount that the state can do. The rest will be in local communities. But when we're looking at energy and power, we do need to ensure that that power is literally in the hands of the communities, taking it away from things like the big 6 energy companies, which have been exploiting people for far too long. And we see right now with the current cost of living crisis, we see oil companies making excessive profits out of people when we could really bring that into community control and into a way that means that it's people that have the power over their own power. When we look at those ways that we can organize in a community, it isn't always the ways of the past, because some of these issues are new. But it's about tackling that broken system and the controls that currently, the state has, that big business has, that capitalism has over these issues that affect people's day-to-day lives. So when I look at the figures and when I look at the science, it's the organisation in communities that will be the final part. Yes, the government can put in place the policies and the structures that mean we can do some of the big ticket reduction and ensure that we are investing into things like a Green New Deal. But a percent will be through organising in communities and ensuring that we are, changing our very relationship with these structures. And I think it's interesting that the word blueprints is being used, because I think that there's a lot, when you look at architecture and when you look at systems architecture, I think you need to build something that makes the old system redundant. But let's face it, in every form of architecture, in most cases, you do need to knock something down to build something better. And this system needs to be broken. It needs to be knocked down. I think the reality of that last IPCC report that says we just have 30 months to ensure that we reach peak emissions, what options are there? I think that those points of community change, of challenging the status quo, are just going to be so vital to ensure that we're doing this and doing it on time. This is, it's called a climate emergency for a reason. And I know that we really aren't embracing that language as a society enough right now, but we do have just a window of opportunity right now to make change happen. And it will be through that revolution in communities, that revolution of change that really breaks those systems that are currently stopping change happening right now.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I actually want to stay with you for a second, because we have a question from one of our viewers, which I think actually others can come back on, which says, all excellent analysis, but back to the, was it the Bangladeshi farmers, just say this struggle isn't successful, then what? A struggle revolution may come, but when and after what? And then, yeah, maybe we'll have Amelia go on that, and then Jodie, and then Derek.
So when and after what, in terms of people's livelihoods have been destroyed and life is being lost? It's how often can we look at the news and see that people are being failed, that people are struggling? Our resources, the resources of those communities are literally being swept away from them. Once, I think what's being alluded to is, how can you organize when you have nothing? And that's what many people are being left with when they are on the coalface of the climate emergency. That's why we need to be organizing now and making sure that we are exposing the fact that the emergency is here now, because it's hit a point where lives are being lost. That's the reality of it. I studied environmental biology. I graduated in 2007. I was quite naive then in terms of where we would be in 2022. I saw all these predictions that were talked about, the bleaching of the coral reefs, of glaciers disappearing, of rising tides, of increasing extreme weather. And I naively thought, someone will do something before that. And that hasn't been the case. We've just seen our carbon emissions increase year upon year upon year. We then had a COVID pandemic, so there was a slight dip then, but really kind of proving the fact that system change is possible. If anything can prove that system change is possible, it was the pandemic. When is the time that people will end their sense that someone will do something about it in the future and will work to do something about it right now?
Thank you very much, Amelia. Jodie, would you like to have a go on that?
I think Amelia spoke very powerfully, and it makes me think, do we think that we will have any significant action on climate change with the governments that we have? And I think that answer, as Amelia's analysis showed, is like, no, right? I mean, the knowledge has been there now for 30 or 40 years. And so the question, so I actually don't have any hope at all that exposing what's going on, exposing the reality of people's death and horrible situations is going to change anything that governments do. I think that the only way to change that is actually to build enough power to either utterly force them in the structure we have, or to overthrow them. I mean, it seems so. I mean, it's almost like revolution is a realistic response. It's not a pipe dream. It seems like if the states that we have are unable to, if they're roadblocks, then they have to be eliminated. Like I think that that with respect to carbon emissions, I do think the state can do something. Namely, states could nationalize all the entire fossil fuel sector and shut it down, right? Like a new state form, like if the state was seized by communists, right? Then you just shut down the fossil fuel sector. And then you can have your community planning around grids. And then of course the communities will have to organize with one another for compensating for places that may not have a lot of sunshine, and people that do have sunshine, and do these sorts of electrical negotiations to make sure that the grids work. But I think that if we don't stop the fossil fuel sector from continuing to pump out oil and gas, then the emissions just go up. I mean, all the electrical grids in the world are not going to stop that. I mean, it seems to me that actually we've got to get into our heads that the situation that we have is the barrier to the response that's necessary, and then we have to, organize accordingly. I mean, it's grim, but I don't see any other realistic option.
Thank you very much on that, Jodie. Derek, would you like to have a go on that?
Yeah, I think Jodie and Amelia have put it very, very well. I mean, I don't think I was entirely clear on the question, but we need to transform society because it's killing us, but we need to act now. So there are many questions, but one I would agree with Jodie very much is you have to be involved in institutions now and infiltrate them and use them and do whatever we can and build solidarity. And revolutionary situations are breaking out. You think of what's happening in Sri Lanka, for example. You have to have the infrastructure to kind of build socialism or communism or eco-socialism, where I would say the base building is about initiating a debate about how you build now.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, this debate and all these discussions, obviously can go on for hours and hours and days. And obviously there's so many angles and so many perspectives we can and we need to explore. One of the things that I wanted to ask, which I think is kind of implied in some of the comments from our viewers, and some of the things that have been said throughout this talk, is this connection between climate change and war. And there's obviously the last few months, there's the situation, there's a situation in Ukraine, and then there's been all this Europe or even like global talk around not buying Russian gas. And of course, in some ways that would be seemingly a great opportunity to say, actually, how do we then make a transition? But now there's essentially more attempts at more encouragement for war and pumping money into the arms industry to now get that gas and that energy from elsewhere, and namely in parts of the Middle East, which I think actually is, in terms of climate change, a very under discussed area of the world. There's obviously many other discussions around it, but now there's all these discussions around, okay, how do we take some of the pipelines through northern Iraq, the Kurdish areas, through Turkey, and how do we get it to Europe instead of Russia, which means that it means more and more war, because it means more and more giving allowances to these states. I mean, I guess the question is, what was there an opportunity with the situation with the invasion of Ukraine in terms of gas? Was there not? Was that just was that actually not an opportunity? Was it always just gonna come from somewhere else? I guess the question is, how do all these connect, and what is the anti-war argument for climate and ecological justice? And Derek, should we have you on that first, and then Jodie, and then Amelia?
I'm hoping you can hear me. Yeah. I'm very much taken with John Bellamy Foster from Monthly Review's recent essay on new exterminism. I think the review is really good and really good on what's happening in the Ukraine. And war is an aspect of climate change. One of the biggest emitters is the US Army. And there are a number of contradictions, but the biggest contradiction is the US and NATO's negative role in the world. And I think one of the things that Green parties could be thinking back to when I was first involved with, like, the Ecology Party in the early 80s, that they were really at the centre of the anti-war movement. So to be serious about climate change, we have to be serious about being anti-war as well. I certainly think there's absolutely nothing good about Putin. But every time there's a foreign policy crisis, we have views which are entirely one-sided and binary. I think of like Lewis Obley's on the new Hitler. So in Britain, we've had things like the Falklands War, various Iraq wars, and our opponents are always the new Hitler, always binary propaganda. So we need a really strong peace movement to say, this isn't entirely binary. I'm critical of Putin, but if you look at the US and the UK, they're just pouring oil on the situation, and you need to negotiate and campaign for peace. So we're in a more dangerous world. Climate change is an aspect of that. And what we have to do in Britain is we always are very good at looking at what other people are doing and morally condemning them. We've got to look, first of all, as I say in the Bible, take it out of your eye, but we're involved in a destructive, murderous war, which we're organising in Yemen. So we don't see very much on the BBC wall to wall about all of the terrible things that we're organising in the Yemen. So I'm not a defender of Putin, but you end up with foreign policy entirely led by the needs of the armed industry in the US, and we have to be looking at the big contradictions between climate change action and anti-war action are two sides of the same coin.
I think that was a great answer, Derek. I very much agree with Derek's approach and Derek's analysis here. It's just remarkable when you think about the fossil fuel dimension, that it's very easy to see the interest of the US and the UK in this war, and that this interest is not about protecting Ukrainian people. It's about securing and protecting energy markets. And this is a kind of place where I don't know, it's like if it were realistic to think that communities forming their own energy grids would be an independent source of power, then this would be exactly the time where that would happen, right? It's just like, oh, we can really oppose this war. We can oppose anyone who supports the war because we have our energy independence over here. But in fact, that takes more capacity than I think it's possible. I mean, it takes so much to build that kind of thing that I don't think that's really an option on local levels, though ideally it could be, because that would be a way to increase the power of a peace movement. So I agree with Derek's analysis.
I think that we've seen an interesting political play at states when it's come to Ukraine. We know that we've known for years that we are working at the whim of a oil and gas market where the price is decided outside the UK. We know that we've been dependent on Russian oil and gas. Well, we've seen poisonings in Salisbury, the poisoning of Litvinenko. The role of Russia on the global stage should have been called to account long before now, and the fact that we were importing, well, across Europe, we've been importing oil and gas could have been challenged at any stage. Right now, there are 649 renewable energy licenses in the pipeline that, if sped up, would meet the demand of the oil and gas we currently get from Russia. But we aren't seeing from the government any move to increase our renewables. In their energy bill, we're seeing a commitment to things like nuclear, to hydrogen, to things that continue to really take control of a different kind of energy mix that isn't about it being linked to communities, but about it being a way that you can continue to profit from, if you've got nuclear, if you've got hydrogen, you're still going to need to have those big projects that will be run by businesses. before we even talk about the climate and the nuclear risk as well. So there's been a real shift in the narrative where I feel like the war has been being used to further a different agenda here in the UK that is about how we push for these kind of more controversial ways of putting energy into our energy mix. They wouldn't be my priorities. Politics is all about priorities and really pushing for those renewable licenses, investing things like the tidal lagoon in Swansea. There are many ways that we can create a better kind of energy structure that works for everyone. I think right now when we're looking at I'm really reminded of the Jared Diamond book, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, where he outlines different ways in which communities in the past have collapsed, citing things like soil erosion. We have to admit that the only reason we exist on this planet is the fact that it rains and that there's about 3 inches of topsoil that is fertile enough to grow things in. He puts in place things like the increase per capita the increased impact per capita person that people have on the planet. And he cites how it moves into other things, including things like conflict. We're not learning lessons from the past. We're not learning lessons from politics. We're not learning lessons from science about how all of these issues are intertwined. And when we look at what's been happening in Ukraine, and when we look further back about what happened in Iraq, we know that what we need to be doing is to ensuring that we are creating an energy mix that means that we're not dependent on foreign oil and gas. I think we have talked about community energy, obviously meaning that if we've got energy production in our own country, that cuts us away from being dependent on those flows from elsewhere. And I think that's also why it is important to have it on the community level as well, because it is about who has power. It's oil and gas. It becomes who has power. But let's not let them right now open new coal mines or drill for more oil or continue an addiction to a broken system that could lead to more climate change, which will lead to more conflict. I feel like this, as I said, this war is being used to promote an agenda that isn't about securing a better future for everyone. It's about securing something more toxic that benefits this toxic government.
Thank you very much for that, Amelia. One of the things I wanted to come back on, I think it seems from, a lot of the discussions like here during tonight and also otherwise, that the most crucial thing is basically to keep, like, for climate change, or to at least slow it down, is to basically keep fossil fuels in the ground. That, it seems like, the most central thing. And I'm getting to one of the questions that one of our viewers has asked, and it seems like, therefore, if that is possible, in terms of the alternatives do already exist, then the reliance is not on the actual substance, but to something else. There's a system that there is an insistence to continue and to often save from itself, i.e. capitalism. The kind of slogan we had from this event is obviously capitalism is the problem and therefore anti-capitalism must be the solution, as a broad slogan, if you will. And so it seems like the reliance is on capital and therefore profit, and especially if the alternatives exist. And I guess, because there's also been discussions from all of you in terms of debate and awareness building and the impact of that, and actually how often people knowing the truth or that winning the debate in some arenas is not necessarily getting us what we need, where we need to get. And Amelia, it was very striking what you said right at the start, where you said, a few years ago this was a debate whether it existed or not. That debate has been won, which is a great thing, but it seems like we're not necessarily closer to the actual practical thing that is needed. So my question is twofold: partly what one of our viewers has asked, and partly something I would like to add. The viewer asked, can you define building capacity for political change? And I guess that speaks to some of the more local and slightly more kind of individual based capacity building that has been discussed. But what I want to add to that is, what in terms of, there's been a lot of discussion around dual power and what is necessary and what to do and what the alternative system could look like. And I know it's difficult to prescribe, but what would be the ideal next step right now? So I guess there's like the more local level and what to do next, basically, for anyone that might be tuning in right now. And a lot of people watch our events later on as well. So I want to go to Jody first on that, and then Amelia, and then Derek. Perhaps we can have something more as a wrap up, and then we're going to do some very quick closing remarks and say bye to everyone tonight. So Jody?
I think being involved in organized party politics, I particularly think that the more revolutionary the party, the better. But I also think that there's need to be in mainstream electoral parties that have capacities to basically to get people appointed to things and have the capacity to reach large amounts of people. And that one needs to be involved in those kinds of party endeavors with a real focus on making sure that climate is a dimension of every struggle, and that we recognize, and that all climate politics also is very much attuned to what the other issues are, so that these struggles merge completely. So it doesn't, so that we escape. Let me step back for a second. Like, one of the problems of politics in the 80s and 90s was it was fragmented into issue groups. And so you have the environmental movement, you've got the women's movement, you got anti-racism, and you got LGBTQ. And I feel like now, maybe like the last 5 or 6 years, the majority of people on the left are working on building these links back and putting it back together as a strong movement. And we're in the middle of that project. And the more that we can be, and Amelia and Derek both spoke well about these interconnecting issues, and in their practice as well, are attuned to this. But I think recognizing that, defeating efforts to separate the issues, making sure that every climate struggle is crucially internationalist and anti-racist, that every struggle around race inequalities is also attuned to the climate dimensions, that we build a fighting collective that's bigger the more that we do that. I think that kind of work is done most effectively through radical parties, because I think radical parties already are working to try to keep a bunch of issues together. The radical party doesn't just like fall apart when the movement goes into an ebb. It stays there and continues to work. So that's what that would be my answer. It's like the orientation is pull all the struggles together and build power.
Amelia?
So, being deputy leader of the Green Party, I completely agree with that organized politics point. There is a chance to have a revolution in our ballot boxes. I would like to see a peaceful green revolution that basically dismantles these current oppressive systems and puts in place something that works to tackle social justice, climate justice, economic justice, and ensuring that we are building a better society for our generation and generations to come. And I think right now that kind of sense of power, it's an energy has been lost. I feel that the build-up of Extinction Rebellion was a real flashpoint that did change things, and a change in understanding that we have in our politics, really, and in our communities about the climate emergency. But that alone wasn't enough. And I keep thinking back to 2007. I think that 2007 was quite an important year. It was the year that an IPCC report came out. It was the year that the Stern Review had come out, which said that it would be cheaper to tackle the climate emergency now than it would be if we let it continue. It was the year that Marks and Spencer's first launched Plan A, because there's no Planet B, and the year that Al Gore put forward an inconvenient truth, which is a form of education. And so I think that we had quite a few things happening at the same time. We had science putting the message out there that we needed to take action now. We had that economic argument that for many people would capture the need for action. We were seeing that kind of easily accessible education about what climate change was and the impact that it would have on people and places around the world. And we also had the science with the IPCC that made it very clear about what was happening. And that felt like, at the time, when you looked at people's, so there's the polling of what people think is important, and it was the first time that climate was above terrorism. Usually terrorism is quite near the top of what people are worried about. And 2007 was the first year where climate was above. It wasn't number one, but it was above terrorism. And if you think about the timing of that, there were terror attacks that had happened around the world. And that was because the public understanding from all kinds of different directions was, this is going to hurt. This will hurt our purses. This will hurt our communities. This could mean flooding. It could mean the devastation for friends, family, neighbors. The reality of climate was there. And I think we're missing that right now. And so in terms of, yes, we need to have that big political change. But what I see too often now is that climate is an add-on. It's like, even look in the media, it's an add-on to everything else. And so whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, one thing I'd really like to challenge everyone watching to do is, how do you, in your work you do, make climate part of the core, not an add-on that's a nice to have? Because only by ensuring that it's at the heart, tackling the climate and ecological emergency is at the heart of all of our work, while also challenging people who don't do it through organizing in other democratic ways, whether that's kind of lobbying, petitioning, protests, whatever that is. We need to be challenging every action that we have, every step that's taken, how we bring climate back into the heart, and see how we can bring that kind of 2007 viewpoint back to where we can genuinely tackle that, well, begin to have the movement in our communities of people understanding where we need to be next. And I think, the austerity and the recession completely changed all of that, and we're at risk of the same happening with the cost of living crisis now. But the fact that the arguments are very clear that we can tackle both of these problems, because climate justice and social justice do go hand in hand, is an important time in our history to ensure that we're getting that message out there in any way we can.
Thank you very much for that, Amelia. And Derek, would you like to come back on that and perhaps also include some of your closing remarks before we start wrapping up? Thank you.
Yep, I would. So concretely, we need to keep fossil fuels underground. So I think part of that is really looking at kind of indigenous people, fighting against tartans and so on. So when I was doing more Green Party politics, a lot of it would be in solidarity with Ecuador and Peru, communities who are fantastically well organised. So I think that's really important to prioritise for revival. We could probably all of us talk a lot about workplace action. So work active. You need to, as workers, make change and talk about just conversion for people working in oil and gas and the military and so on, so that the people actually who are at the coalface, they lead the way and they come up with alternatives. So that's a huge dimension we haven't really had time to talk about, but it is so important. Concretely, I would say base building. That's the English situation. Hundreds of thousands of people join the Labour Party. They're disillusioned. There's a very violent campaign against the left. Certainly it's important to have the most revolutionary party as possible. And I certainly, I'm a non-dogmatic Marxist, and I communicate with people in various parties, but I think there's not instantly perfect, kind of party form. But concretely, go on the web, look at Welsh Underground Network, look at Philly Socialists. premier base building organizations, so fully socialist, Marxist Leninists, somewhere between me and Jody, built up from a few people, like 300 militant activists in Philly, squatted lands for a community garden centre, built their tenants union, feeding people, and that built capacity for change. And again, Welsh Underground Network, people who'd been through Labour and Plaid and were utterly disillusioned, didn't quite see the most revolutionary parties being as the young, and they started community action, and they're really building, and they've got food problem programs. So if you're in Philly or Wales, join those organisations. They're really fucking good. And if you're anywhere else, look at what they've done, get in touch with them, find 2 or 3 people, have a stall in your city centre, give away coffee, talk to people, communicate, get the capacity, start doing food programs, start looking at how you can help people in fuel poverty. And that's not the whole revolutionary solution, but I think it's better than pretty much anything else happening on the left in Britain. And that has the capacity to build an eco-socialism where we fight and win. And even if we're wrong, some comradeship and people get fed. And certainly, if you look at the debate that Jody and I have, that's the term we want, these kind of serious questions about state and organisation. It's essential to have like a study group, look at key tech, then in ecosystem, and self-educate. Quite often in the left or beyond, there are sort of political texts, they used to, at least we've got to have the learning. So to me, there's almost infinite dimension of things that we have to, but part of that is build the base, serve the people, and that's more about building a revolutionary army and transforming anything than mild reform.
Thank you very much, Derek. Would you like to come for a closing remark, Amelia?
Just to thank you for inviting me. A thank you to Derek very specifically as well. And thanks, Jody, for your inspiration too. It's been a brilliant evening, and I definitely feel like I'm leaving with a lot of food for thought. So I just, as always, just want to remind people of their own power. When we're talking about climate issues, I know it's easy to feel powerless, but the only way we're going to make change happen is if we all remember that we need to be taking responsibility and pass on that inspiration. So, do keep remembering your own power at every single stage.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And Jody, let's have them from you.
I very much appreciate the serious and long-term committed work of Derek and Amelia. It's absolutely crucial, and the more people that are involved in this kind of work, the better. What makes the work important is when it's collective and combined. That that no one can do it alone. No one person's contributions are essential, right? What matters is the collective strength and the collective energy that's possible. Everything that one does is enabled by other people and dependent on other people. And keeping that kind of collectivity and connectivity at the core, I think, is going to be crucial, not just to being effective, but to combating the quickly approaching ideological war with the liberal capitalists who want us to think that markets and light bulbs will solve the problem, with the imperialist who want to say, oh, climate change isn't important, but the maintaining US and British global hegemony is important. We've got to be able to combat that. And also our collectivity will also be really, really crucial in building up the ideological barrier against forms of eco-fascism that are going to be rooted in racism, colonialism, nationalism, and say that holding our own space is what matters. And if we're not strong in building a really vigilant, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-colonialist climate movement, climate justice, then we won't be able to withstand that onslaught, because the climate crisis is here, as everyone has said. And folks, as the more desperate it gets, the more appealing an organized right will be. So the left has to be a force strong enough to, strong enough, powerful enough, persuasive enough to let people want to be with us and not with them.
Thank you very much for that, Jodie. That is certainly an incredible point to end on. I want to thank all of you for joining us today on the YouTube live stream. And if you're watching this at a later time, I hope you enjoyed this incredible discussion. Thank you very much, Derek. Thank you very much, Amelia. Thank you very much, Jodie. I know you're all very busy, and so thank you very much for spending the time to have this discussion today. We certainly look forward to way more. And just to close off, if you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, visit leftbookclub.com, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you'll get to find out about some of the incredible events like this that we organize. And while you're on the YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There was some discussion about getting together, discussing. We also have and are further developing a network of reading groups. So if you have a reading group or would like to start one, please get in touch with us. You can get in touch with us on Twitter or on Instagram, and we are happy to support that process as well, because we care about people reading, we care about people debating, and we care about people organizing, whether it's Left Book Club books or not. So thank you very much, and hope you have a good evening or good rest of your day wherever you are, and take care.